There are moments in war when the world seems to tilt, just slightly, before everything changes. In the early months of the Pacific War, Japanese commanders believed they understood the Americans they were fighting. Their intelligence reports, their pre-war assumptions, and even their own propaganda painted a simple picture: the U.S. Marines were inexperienced, soft, and unlikely to endure a long and brutal campaign across the islands of the Pacific. But then, almost quietly at first, that belief began to crack. It didn't shatter in a single clash of armies or in one sudden catastrophe. Instead, the shift came through scattered reports, desperate night encounters, and the stubborn resistance of Marines stranded on jungled shores. Each skirmish carried the same message, whispered from Guadalcanal to the Central Pacific. These men would not break. And when that realization finally reached Tokyo, it overturned Japan's entire calculus for the war. This is the story of that transformation told through the battles that forced Japan to confront a new truth about its enemy. From the humid jungles of Guadalcanal to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, what did Japanese officers truly see? And what made them understand, at last, that this war would not go as they had imagined? The war in the Pacific began with a series of Japanese victories so swift and overwhelming that Tokyo grew confident its assessments of the United States had been correct. To Japanese planners, the U.S. Marines were a symbolic force, brave perhaps, but lacking the seasoning required for prolonged island warfare. The Pacific, with its choking jungles, disease-ridden swamps, and unforgiving tides, was expected to break them long before Japanese steel did. That belief followed Japan into the opening stages of the Guadalcanal campaign. In August 1942, when American transports edged toward the island's dark coastline, Japanese officers did not expect a decisive confrontation. They assumed the Marines would seize ground, grow disorganized, and collapse under pressure once the counterattacks came. For the Japanese army, night fighting was a prized tradition, a place where discipline and ferocity were supposed to tilt the balance. American troops, they believed, would panic in the darkness. But within days, the reports coming back whispered an entirely different story. Marines, cut off from naval support after the disastrous Battle of Savo Island, dug into the humid earth and refused to budge. Their supplies were thin, their rations dwindled, medicine was scarce, malaria gnawed at them. Japanese aircraft pounded Henderson Field almost daily, and the jungle itself took more than a few exhausted men. Yet the Marines did not break. A Japanese officer later wrote in frustration, "We assumed the Americans could not fight at night, but even in darkness they held their lines as if it were morning. This was beyond our expectations." Small clashes in the jungle turned into grim lessons for the Japanese command. Patrols that were expected to shatter the American perimeter instead found Marines maneuvering with discipline, conserving ammunition, using fieldcraft effectively, and communicating under conditions that should have unraveled a less organized force. The U.S. Marines did not fight like the adversary Japan had prepared for. They adapted quickly. They held together. They matched ferocity with coordination. And when Japanese troops launched their large-scale assaults believing weight of numbers and night tactics would overwhelm the Americans, the Marines absorbed the blows, shifted positions with precision, and counterattacked with controlled firepower. What Japan had dismissed as inexperience now appeared as something altogether more dangerous: resilience under pressure. Guadalcanal became the first fracture in Japan's wartime assumptions. The island exposed a truth that officers in Tokyo had not anticipated. They were facing an opponent who would suffer, endure, and continue to fight even when the odds turned. Bleak. It was only the beginning, but already the narrative Japan relied upon was starting to collapse. Guadalcanal was no longer just a battlefield, it was a warning of what was coming. If Guadalcanal cracked Japan's assumptions, the assault on Tarawa shattered them outright. The island, little more than a strip of coral, fortified with concrete bunkers, interlocking machine gun nests, and pre-sighted killing zones, was designed to make any amphibious assault bleed. Japanese commanders were confident that no force on Earth could storm it quickly. They believed the Marines would be pinned on the beaches, stalled by tide, reef, and relentless fire. But what unfolded stunned the surviving defenders. Before the first landing craft even touched the reef, U.S. naval guns hammered the island with a ferocity that rewrote Japanese expectations of American firepower. Battleships and cruisers poured high-caliber shells into hardened bunkers. Carrier aircraft strafed strongpoints that had taken months to build. The Japanese defenders, trained to believe their fortifications were impervious, realized, sometimes too late, that American coordination between sea, air, and infantry was more than overwhelming force. It was a system, a machine built for war. Yet the real surprise came after the landing when the battle grew confused, personal, and brutal. Marines were pinned in the surf, cut down in the shallows, and forced to crawl across sand that offered no protection. It was chaos. But it was the kind of chaos they adapted to with startling speed. Small units reorganized under fire. Leaders made decisions in seconds. Marines advanced yard by yard through smoke and flame, refusing to stall even as casualties mounted. One Japanese officer, interviewed after the war, confessed, "Their will did not weaken when we expected it to. They fought as if they expected to win." Tarawa taught Japan a difficult truth. American firepower was not reckless, and Marine aggression was not undisciplined. Both were calibrated, deliberate, and terrifying when combined. But it was Saipan that brought the realization into full focus. Strategically vital, Saipan was one of the last shields protecting the Japanese homeland. From its airfields, American bombers could strike Tokyo itself. Japanese troops defended it with desperation, and their officers watched closely as the Marines advanced across the island. What they witnessed unnerved them. The Marines fought with a level of organization that few armies in the world could match. Under artillery fire, they reformed lines in minutes. When flanked, they shifted as if guided by instinct. Their communication with naval guns and close air support units operated like a single, coherent organism, precise, adaptable, relentless. More troubling for Japan was the American mastery of logistics. Supplies were unloaded continuously, even under fire. Ammunition caches were replenished with astonishing efficiency. Wounded Marines were treated and evacuated so quickly that units rarely buckled under attrition. For the Japanese command, Saipan became a grim revelation. They were not fighting just a brave enemy. They were fighting a nation capable of sustaining war in a way Japan simply could not match. The Pacific was tilting, and each island made the shift more undeniable. By the time American forces approached Peleliu in late 1944, Japanese commanders believed they finally understood the Marine Corps. They had seen the discipline at Guadalcanal, the firepower at Tarawa, and the organizational strength at Saipan. Yet they still clung to one hope, that a prolonged, grinding defense might finally break the Marines' will. Peleliu was engineered for exactly that purpose. Instead of meeting the Americans on the beaches, Japanese defenders retreated into a labyrinth of caves, tunnels, and interlocking fortifications carved into the island's coral ridges. Their plan was simple: force the Marines into a battle of exhaustion, a slow, crushing war of attrition and heat, so intense it warped steel and dehydrated men in hours. But what followed confounded every expectation. Marines fought through terrain that tore their boots apart and left them bloodied before they even reached the enemy. They scaled ridges under sniper fire, assaulted cave entrances with flamethrowers, and advanced through fields so blasted by artillery that even veterans hesitated before entering. Casualties rose sharply. The suffering was immediate and immense, yet the lines did not collapse. A Japanese officer later admitted in a battlefield report, "We expected their spirit to diminish. Instead, their determination only grew." Peleliu was not just a tactical struggle, it was a psychological blow to Japanese command. The Marines demonstrated that endurance was not merely part of their training. It was embedded in their identity. No matter how punishing the circumstances, no matter how horrific the terrain, they continued to push forward with a steadiness that defied Japanese assumptions about American weakness. But the final and most devastating realization came at Iwo Jima. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had studied the United States more closely than any Japanese commander. He understood American industrial power, the depth of its manpower, and the discipline of its Marines. Long before the first landing craft hit the black volcanic sand, he warned Tokyo, "Do not underestimate them. They are stronger than you think." Iwo Jima proved him right in the most brutal way. The Marines faced an enemy fighting from tunnels, bunkers, and concealed artillery positions that made the island one of the most lethal battlefields of the war. Every foot of ground was contested. Every ridge was a fortress. The volcanic ash swallowed boots, slowed movement, and offered no protection from fire. Yet the Marines advanced. They advanced when pinned by machine guns. They advanced when entire companies were reduced to handfuls of men. They advanced when the island seemed determined to swallow them whole. Kuribayashi's reports, written in moments of clarity amid the chaos, captured what Japanese propaganda had never allowed: the Marines' ability to combine firepower coordination, and sheer resolve into a single, unstoppable force. By the time the island fell, Japanese officers no longer debated American strength. They accepted it. The shock that began at Guadalcanal had become an unshakable truth. As the island battles unfolded, the United States was undergoing its own transformation. What began as a desperate struggle in the Pacific gradually evolved into a demonstration of America's capacity to wage modern, industrialized war, something the world had not fully grasped before Guadalcanal, Tarawa, or Saipan. Each hard-fought Marine victory signaled more than territorial gain. It revealed the strategic depth of a nation preparing for a long global conflict. American military planners viewed these battles not as isolated clashes, but as stepping stones in a broader campaign, an island-hopping strategy designed to close the ring around Japan. The Marines' ability to seize and secure airfields allowed the U.S. Army Air Forces to push bombers ever closer to the Japanese mainland. Logistics, once considered a mundane detail of war, became a quiet instrument of power. Supplies moved across the Pacific in quantities no other nation could match, reinforcing the impression that American endurance was not just a battlefield trait, but a national capability. The world took notice. Allied observers, particularly from Britain and Australia, saw in the Marine Corps a force that embodied both tactical innovation and moral resolve. Reports circulated in military circles describing the Marines' adaptability, their ability to shift from amphibious assaults to jungle warfare to bunker clearing with little pause. For smaller nations watching from afar, these battles illustrated a new model of coordinated warfare, one where air, sea, and ground forces operated as a single strategic organism. Japan, meanwhile, found its diplomatic and military position deteriorating sharply. The fall of Saipan sent shockwaves through Tokyo, cabinet ministers resigned, and Emperor Hirohito himself began receiving increasingly grim assessments from his senior commanders. The myth of American fragility, once a cornerstone of Japanese military doctrine, had dissolved completely. In its place stood an uncomfortable recognition. Japan was now engaged in a war it could not win. For the broader world, the Marine victories became markers of a shifting global order. They signaled the rise of the United States as the dominant Pacific power and showcased a form of warfare rooted in technological integration and industrial might. The lessons were unmistakable. Strategy without resources was brittle, and morale without logistics could not hold indefinitely. In the ashes of these island battles, nations began to understand the new shape of modern conflict and the price required to survive it. When the smoke finally lifted over the islands of the Pacific, what remained was more than wreckage, more than the silence that follows artillery fire. What remained was a truth Japan had never intended to confront, one revealed step by step across Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and the black sands of Iwo Jima. The U.S. Marines had not won because of numbers alone. They had not endured because of luck or circumstance. They prevailed because they embodied a blend of discipline, adaptability, coordination, and sheer human resilience that reshaped the Pacific War. Every Japanese report, every captured document, every after-action assessment pointed toward the same conclusion. The Marines were not the fragile adversaries pre-war intelligence had predicted. They were a force built for hardship, one that grew stronger as the conflict deepened. And in recognizing this, Japan saw the future of the war. They saw the cost that was coming. Yet the legacy of these battles extends far beyond strategy. It lives in the stories of the men who carried rifles across coral reefs under machine gun fire, who dug foxholes in volcanic ash, who wrote letters home they never had the chance to send. It lives in the lessons whispered to new generations of Marines that determination is not a temporary state, but a discipline shaped in the harshest moments of history. The world, too, absorbed these lessons. Military academies study the island campaigns as case studies in coordination and endurance. Nations recognize how easily confidence can become complacency and how dangerous it is to underestimate an opponent's resolve. The Pacific War became a somber reminder that industrial strength, tactical clarity, and human spirit together can alter the direction of global history. And for us standing decades removed from the gunfire, the question remains, what do we take from these battles? Which lessons speak to our time, and which warnings still echo across the ocean? As you reflect on these campaigns, consider the cost behind every inch of ground gained and the courage carried by those who fought there. If this story has given you something to think about war, about history, about the choices nations make, feel free to share your thoughts below. And if you value these journeys into the past, you're invited to stay with us. There are many more chapters of military history left to uncover.